This is Hannah, and you're listening to the University of Chicago Public Policy Podcasts. You're listening to Root of Conflict, a podcast about violent conflict around the world and the people, societies, and policy issues it affects. In this series, you'll hear from experts and practitioners who conduct research, implement programs, and use data analysis to address some of the most pressing challenges facing our world. Root of Conflict is produced by UC3P in collaboration with the Pearson Institute for the Study and Resolution of Global Conflict, a research institute housed within the Harris School of Public Policy at the University of Chicago. What kind of ethical concerns should researchers think about when deciding to take on a project? In this episode, we speak with Professor Austin Wright, an assistant professor of public policy at Harris and a faculty affiliate of the Pearson Institute. We speak about his past and current research projects in Afghanistan, dual-use infrastructure, and broad U.S. policy interventions. We also talk about his work teaching as a professor, his advice for students, and how his life journey has influenced his understanding of conflict and ripple effects. Hi, my name is Hannah Balikci, and I'm a second-year MPP student and Pearson Fellow.
Hi, I'm Austin Wright. I'm an assistant professor here at the Harris School of Public Policy and an affiliate of the Pearson Institute.
Hey everyone, my name is Jose Macias. I'm a first-generation Chicano, and I'm also a second-year MPP student and Pearson Fellow.
So Austin, could you introduce yourself, how you came to Harris and your work, why conflict, and how you got into all of this?
Sure, yeah. So, I think that how I got into conflict, I think is a story about a really pivotal time in my life. So, when 9/11 happened, I happened to be at a high school in San Antonio, and when the towers were struck, my school went into lockdown. Those who are listening to the podcast might know, but might also not know that San Antonio is military city USA. We have a large number of bases, a large constellation of military infrastructure there. And so my school went into lockdown and because of that, and concerns of the potential that San Antonio or nearby sites might be struck during sort of large-scale coordinated attack, which was unclear if that was happening on that day. And the person that I was locked down with happened to be, again, military city USA. Their partner was at the Pentagon. And when they found out the Pentagon had been hit, they, of course, went through this period of trying to gather information. Communications were locked down. They weren't able to get in contact with them. So, I spent that day, a day of tremendous suffering in the United States and abroad. I spent that day with someone who was, in a very real sense, going through this, the phases of reckoning with the potential that they had just lost their partner. And I think, up until that point, I was a young teenager. I didn't really have a sense of what terrorism meant, and I think many people around that age kind of experienced it for the first time then. We weren't really thinking about the attack on the World Trade Center that had occurred before, or even necessarily the attack on the USS Cole. That really didn't strike home for a lot of young people. But this day, that event, and in particular being with someone who was processing live just how close terror can come to individuals who are thousands of miles away. That made the stakes really clear for me. And from that point forward, I became really interested in foreign policy. I became really interested in the notion of how people use violence as an alternative means of politics. And that day really solidified for me an interest in finding ways that we might both understand what the root causes of conflict are, as well as thinking, good plug for the show. But also ultimately how, if we understand, right, if we can understand what are the causes of conflict, what are the root causes, what are the drivers of participation, why do individuals feel the need to resort to violence in this way, how can ultimately generate a set of challenges, right? And I think a core part of what I hope the Harris School is doing is not just thinking about that set of problems, thinking about what the drivers are. The opportunity came, so you asked how I ended up here. When the opportunity came to join Harris, I jumped at it, right? In part because it was around this time that the Pearson Institute was forming. There was a lot of excitement about the potential that could promote, both on the research front and on the policy making or policy advocacy front. And, I'm here because I'm excited about that work. And I think all of us, those maybe the folks listening to the podcast, I think a lot of the folks in this room right now are thinking about how do we not just identify what drivers are, but how we can go out and build a better, more prosperous, more just world, a world that our kids are going to live in, right? And my kids live in, and this is what motivates me and the work that I do and the advocacy that I do because of that. Um, and I think that what this has enabled, I don't mean to be too long-winded, but is that when we struggle with we're all purpose-seeking animals, right? And we can find purpose in any number of ways, and the purpose that I have found in my life, at least at this moment of my life, is really how to build that more just and like secure and prosperous world for my children and their friends and their like the children that they will have. And a big part of that is not just how we identify origins, but find solutions, and how do we reinforce our relationships with strategic allies, abroad, especially in the Gulf.
That's awesome. So, thinking about your impact and since joining Harris, you've talked about 8 generations of scholars now. Could you describe what shaping a generation of policymakers is like at the Harris School for you? And if so, in addition to that, what are like 3 things you want your graduates to remember when they leave?
Dang. Okay. Yeah. No. That's real. I feel like doing the numbers right. I have the good fortune of people sometimes enjoying my lectures, and so sometimes they're a little overpopulated. That's probably at least 2,000 students that I've taught that have come through that I've touched in some way, and many of which have gone off and worked, in the public sector, right? Have gone off and done important work there. Have gone off and done work in the private sector. Have gone off and worked in like city and local government. And look, not all of us need to study these questions. Not all of us are like, driven or motivated by the questions of understanding conflict. But I think all of us are driven by a core set of interests in how do we use policy as this lever. And ultimately people, I hope, leave, the courses I teach here are mostly in the core and mostly focus on how do we leverage data to generate the insights that will ultimately shape policy. And I think so that's the aspiration. I think that we've done those programs internally with folks here at Harris. Big picture, we've also expanded the offerings that Harris can provide so that we can reach beyond. Jose, you've been an instrumental part. This is kind of how we first met, and you've been an instrumental partner in enabling us to be able to take those opportunities elsewhere. Ultimately, more recently, thought about going out and not just working with people who are thinking about going to graduate school, but also thinking about people who are already working for governments and enabling them to be successful. We're doing that with a strategic partner in the security arrangement of the United States, and I think that's a meaningful thing, and that goes just beyond the scope of Pearson. Now, 3 things I hope students who leave Harris, who I've interacted with, are ultimately thinking about. I think the first is, that in order to do good work, we need to understand the settings, right? We need to understand the context. That, I think a lot of folks often confuse running regressions with a true understanding of what's going on. But, once you really understand what you can learn from the regression, you do know that, like, in order to get the most out of this tool, in order to get the most out of data, you have to understand what generates the data. You have to understand the local context. You have to understand drivers and measurement. And that just requires a tremendous amount of institutional knowledge. And I hope that, people coming through here don't get confused about the fact that just because I'm looking at a table or I'm looking at a really beautiful figure, that it's necessarily telling me anything meaningful if I don't know about the So that's the first thing. I think the second thing really is that, like, I hope our students leave with the skills to both, like, be good, hopefully be good producers, but if they can't be good producers of research, that they know how to more skeptically consume research. And I mean, that's part of the first thing, but I think it's also much bigger, right? That how to ask questions about, what is generating the sample, what are the potential biases that are here. Part of that is understanding context, but also part of that is also understanding the method you're using or what the method other people are using. And I think, the third thing that I hope that students leave my class with an understanding of is that, there are many people here at Harris that care. There are many people here at Harris that want to enable our students to be successful. We are, as an institution, I hope that we're committed to this. But at the very least, I hope my students understand that if they ever need to come back and they want to talk about a problem, that, whether it's professional or personal, whatever, mostly professional, right? I'm here for talk therapy, but mostly I'm here to give you advice about how to like make better policy. But like I would hope that they understand they can come back, right? There's a home for them here, and I mean that like both here, like in a literal sense, but there is a home for them in an intellectual sense where they can come and find me wherever I am in the world. And if they have a problem and I have the time and bandwidth to help them solve that problem, I will give them everything I have. And we talked about this, Jose. I think that's just part of, and when we think about, for me, like the true origin of like the roots of my interest here, right, and intersect very closely with a lot of those drivers we were talking about earlier, right, which is that like I grew up in abject poverty in some sense. We had holes in our roof, we had holes in our ceilings and black mold. We didn't have heat, right? We didn't have AC, and like what enabled me to be successful was that people were committed, right? And so I hope that people leave my class with the sense that I'm equally committed to their success. Because people in the past have like seen something in me and took gambles and like made flyers and you know they took a pass, right? And I hope that like the gamble paid off and I'm here to pay that part forward. So yeah, third thing, hopefully.
Yeah. One of the things you talk about, you teach the core classes,
Yeah.
but there's a class you also take that's big data and development. And I was just wondering to get your thoughts on what's your definition of big data and how do you use it within your research and how do you use data, the context that you talked about, and together to create research?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think that big data has like no single definition in the sense that like how big does it have to be? In this class, what we're focused on is a broad set of settings for people innovating on data collection, people are innovating on measurement, people are innovating on like clever research designs, all of which leverage large scale data. And I think that one of the benefits of a class like this is I get to teach papers that I like. I get to share some of the cool things, but we don't shy away from the fact, look, we're scientists, right? Like in everything, like nothing I do is perfect, right? And nothing that anyone else does is perfect. And there are always things that we can improve on. That should be our mission as scientists, is to find the ways that we can improve that which we see and ensure that it's as robust as possible and as meaningful as possible. And that class gives us an opportunity to read through like papers at the bleeding edge of data science and big data as it intersects with social science and the questions of interest for us in development, which is a broad spectrum, right? It's like political development, it's economic development, it's development in fragile settings, often which are marred by conflict. And to both think about how to do good work in those places that leverages things like remote sensing, right? So satellite imagery, high frequency satellite imagery at super granular levels. Whether like in yesterday's class we were talking about a really nice paper on fires like crop burning in Pakistan and India, and a super nice, super interesting paper. But I hope that the students understand that like I really like this paper. I think this paper is excellent in many, many dimensions. But there are many things that we can do to potentially tweak it around the edges and improve it. And when they come in and they see that cool data, they see like all this high frequency information, they see the beautiful data viz. I hope that doesn't keep them from asking skeptical questions. Okay, just because this is great doesn't mean it can't be. Right? Yeah.
Yeah, I think that kind of goes into like some of the projects and that you worked on and like you talked about context. You've been to Afghanistan before, like 2021. One of your projects that I think was released last year was territorial control, and even just like talking about non-state actors and how that creates conflict and how I think just how the control and effective sovereignty of political entities like can be measured through big data, but also just like how did you, I don't know, I guess my real question with this is how did you come to that research topic and how did you like use the context you had from being in Afghanistan to sort of say like, okay, this is something we can measure. Like how do you take those results and can you apply them to other places and like what's the policy outcome you want to have from that?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. Yeah, so we had a project that leveraged some rather incredible survey data that had been sponsored by NATO, and we negotiated through Pearson early on access to this data. We just moved to Keller, and I was here. I couldn't sleep, and at that time I lived here, really close to Keller, probably way too close to code. So when I couldn't sleep, I would just come to the office like super late at night, and I would just read And I happened to be reading one of the reports that came alongside that survey data. Basically explains how do they collect it in the field. And I was thumbing through these extremely long documents, and I get to the very end of one of them, and it's explaining something called a sampling resampling. And what I was seeing in this report was this notion that like the Taliban was actively blocking them from going in and collecting data in certain places. And and then, I was leaning back in my chair, I fell down, I hit my head pretty hard. I went and kind of okay. I'm joking about this part. This is my like apple hitting me on the head type moment. No, it was just like in that moment I
Think you okay? It's 2 in the morning.
That's right. That's right. At 2 in the morning, and I wake up, it's like little birdies like flying around my head. No, it's like in that moment, I just kind of had this like aha where it's like, okay, everything that we see is conditional on being able to go collect data, and the data they're collecting is sensitive, right? The data they're collecting is insights into how civilians behave, what they believe, what they prefer, and insights like about like the operations of the Taliban, right? And so if you are this non-state actor, and it's smart because you asked a question about generalizability and like whether or not I can take this and take it to other places. And I think that in that sense, it's like portable in that non-state actors, whether it's the Taliban, whether it's, the FARC or former FARC or paramilitaries or armed groups or criminal armed groups or just criminal organizations in general, or even like just regular political actors will often have incentives to keep people from knowing information about their activities. They want to keep that private. And their ability to keep it private in a setting like this reveals something about their power. And it reveals something about the territorial integrity of what they control in geographic sense, because this is all in-person data collection. They're like constantly pinging these districts, trying to go in and access them, and what's happening is that there's territorial integrity. Those data collectors are going to get blocked, right? And if they have an incentive to block them, they're going to keep them out. And so that's where that project came from. I didn't actually fall. Listeners, it did not need to seek medical attention, but it was this aha moment where it's like, okay, the sampling, resampling process in these surveys is instrumental for thinking about whether or not we even see the data, and that gives us some insights into the battle space.
So thinking about, we were talking about this international paradigm. Austin, it sounds like you came of age after 9/11, which was, impacted an entire generation of scholars. What do you think now as you sit here, you do this research, you leverage different kinds of methods? What does evidence policymaking look like under strategic competition with near-peer commitment? What does that look like? Do the research, but how do we articulate findings? How do we drive impact? This idea of strategic competition as we've transitioned from the war on terror to what we see today.
That's a hard one. I think that, in an ideal sense, what we would be able to do is have a line of communication to share insights from our work with stakeholders who are making decisions. And that's a difficult thing to achieve, whether it's, during periods of counterinsurgency or period now, something like great power competition or near peer, or as we recently found out with like the war in Ukraine, like maybe not near peer. But big picture, still concerns, right? We want to take those potential threats very seriously. So there is something that emerged that Pearson has supported, that Harris School has been an active participant in, which is something called the Empirical Studies of Conflict. It's a project that was initially funded by support from DoD to create exactly this, a network, researchers, all committed to the same core sort of credible causal approach, or at least the credible approach to social science research on these questions, right? And to give advice. And we have a seat at the table in some sense, right? We can share those insights. We have partners. And again, that's because you have to build out reputation. You have to build out that relationship. They need to be able to say, okay, I can like reasonably rely on what you're saying because the work you do is high quality, and I can differentiate between you and someone who's just a talking head on TV. Now, that organization was originally founded with like the focus on the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, right? These were counterinsurgency conflicts. But the toolkit that we use, like the toolkit that we teach our students here, right, is portable, right? I can take it from studying these sets of questions and I can use it to study questions, not necessarily questions of like true like grand strategy, right? but I can use it to think about like very precise questions in the context of like great power competition and like near peer competition and the threats that we face in an international setting and not just in a counterinsurgency setting. And we're beginning to do that. And in fact, like one of the big projects that we're launching is focusing on that transition, right? Is focusing on like not and we're rolling up those old projects. Like we still need to learn the lessons of those conflicts because we invested a lot of blood and treasure in those wars. We need to learn from them to prepare for the next set of counterinsurgencies because these wars will not go away. These wars won't go away. And when the United States is in a position to intervene in support of a strategic ally or to intervene in a humanitarian sense, like I hope that we don't shy away from our obligation to humanity as this great nation. But we also need to prepare for an imminent set of concerns at a global scale, which are not that. And we're beginning to work on those sets of projects to understand how we can prepare for that eventuality, because it's better to be prepared than to be caught off guard. We're getting ready for that.
Can you give a teaser to the audience? What kind of projects are coming down the pipeline?
Yeah, so we have a series of projects on Ukraine specifically. We've launched a couple of projects there. We've already wrapped up one of those big projects about how we can better inform the public during episodes of instability, how we can message to them, understanding how responsive they are, and figuring out better systems to help our allies in a setting where Ukraine is now engaged in a near-peer competition with Russia, right? That's what we're seeing, and that stalemate creates a lot of potential concerns about the civilians getting adjusted to that. So that was what that project was about. But in terms of like that sort of, I don't really see this as a tripolar world. This is like my kind of hot take. The Russian forces are not prepared for what the United States would be able to unleash in a ground war. That's obvious, and I don't. That is not near peer competition in a broad sense, right? But there is a coming conflict with another nearby nation, right? A rising nation that is recognizing its place in the world and would like to reshape the world in its vision. And that nation is also facing a series of internal crises and will soon find it probably politically advantageous to engage in a large-scale military conflict or military buildup to offset a crumbling economy. And the United States needs to be prepared for that eventuality and is increasingly becoming prepared for the possibility that that state won't just harness military capacity, but will harness its strategic investments in the acquisition of seaports and trade terminals globally. And so that is the work that we're doing, is to understand just what the consequences are of the massive, massive spending that they have been doing, buying up the majority of the world's most important ports, and what potential consequences that might have for global trade. And of course, if that nation only directly controls somewhere on the order between 6 to 8% of global trade. So even if they withdrew from the global economy, I mean, of course, it would be a massive hit in terms of manufacturing and production. But there could be strategic reallocation. But through their port acquisitions, they now control probably something on the order between 65 and 75% of global trade through their ports.
Wow.
And that is of grave concern at a global scale. And our project is to better understand what the consequences are of that amount of acquisition, and kind of doing some scheming about settings where they might be able to leverage that tremendous power they now have in a commercial sense as an extension, right, of the state, right, to those commercial enterprises. And the way to think about this is, in the wake of World War II, the United States chose guns. We have naval assets deployed globally. We have military assets deployed globally. They have chosen butter. And they have chosen to be able to control the global flow of butter. And they have chosen ways of being able to influence who gets that, how much they pay for it. And they can use those means potentially to completely destabilize global trade. And that represents an existential threat to the global system.
Wow.
So.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it does represent an existential threat to the global system, and especially to the United States. But like looking towards the Western Hemisphere, take for example the situation in Ecuador, where the president has declared a state of internal armed conflict. So like, yeah, how do you? I don't know. But then, what is a way where you can then the situation in Ecuador, in Latin America in general? How do you get the economic situation in a place where people stay instead of coming to the U.S. for economic opportunities, or even also fleeing violence. There's the two sides of that. So you have to do both the immediate violence, and we've seen that in Bukele in El Salvador. How do you do the violence stuff, but also the Band-Aid for right now, but then also getting to the root cause of the violence.
These are many dimensional problems, right? And if we think about gaming out a strategy that helps us resolve one thing, it might sort of inadvertently have these sort of second, third order effects that we have not carefully thought through. And yeah, I mean, in the end, like what the listeners, if they know me, they probably know like I'm a Harry Potter fan. So this is like Snape, like turning.
What's your house?
Bro, obviously Slytherin.
Yeah, same.
Wow.
Same, yeah.
Bro. Like,
that's real fake of
But
y'all.
like, but I will say, I admit
it's
that I'm a
cunning.
Slytherin, but it's like I struggle against some of these things, right? I try to be like I made a commitment this year to be more empathetic, right? So Snape is turning to Dumbledore, being like, "You ask too much." Right. Have you ever stopped to think that you ask too much? And I do think that this is something we need to think seriously about, right? That like there are a multitude of drivers all interacting with each other that like if we want a sustainable intentional solution or a sustainable intentional intervention that we hope looks something like a solution, then it involves us like thinking about all of the complexities involved in what the drivers are, right? And the interaction between those local economic conditions and violence. Right, and the fact that some individuals are fleeing the lack of economic opportunity, some individuals are fleeing the presence of violence, and some of them are fleeing places where these two things are very closely interconnected with one another.
Right.
And of course, like, we're also running up against very very serious like strategic concerns that we might have about like the sort of the replacement rate in the United States, like our birth rate, right, the extent to which we can pay for our social service commitments that have been made to like an increasingly elderly population, right? And of course, like, how has the United States been able to do this over time? Because we've been significantly increasing the presence of immigrants who are paying into the system but are not yet benefiting from it, right? And so all of these things have to be sort of taken together and thought about in concert with one another. But I think the tricky part is like, all right, are we asking too much of a process that can barely get the answer right on a very simple set of problems, and this is a really complex one, and we need to take seriously like what can actually be done to address that, right? Anyway. Yeah,
I mean, I think of that like sometimes it feels like the U.S. is almost doing too much, right? This is just more of like a personal thought that there's a lot of policy that's being done by the U.S. to different countries around the world, and does it feel like sometimes the U.S.'s policies are, I mean, I think of like U.S. sanctions in Venezuela, right? The secondary effects that happen from that are now not necessarily that it's only that, but that the economic situation as a result of the U.S. sanctions in Venezuela has led to this migration throughout South America. And now with the Barbados Agreement, trying to walk that back.
I think that just kind of goes to show like they're shifting priorities. And how do you adapt to a shifting priority, right? It sounds like this was probably an effort by the administration to try to offset oil or just in general energy crisis by introducing more oil to the market writ large. So, but I think it goes to like, is the U.S. doing too much, or is it how do you balance your priorities given what's going on in the shifting world or international conflict? So
yeah, I mean it's a tricky problem, right? Because when you think about the sanctions question, right? We don't necessarily when the initial decision is made, we tend to think about this as like a partial equilibrium problem, where it's like, can it have the direct effect that's intended on that target audience without thinking about the sort of downstream, general equilibrium effects it might have, the externalities it might create, or the second and third order effects, right? And, that's because often, this kind of gets back to the conversation we were just having before, right, that like the policymaking process can rarely gets like simple problems, right?
Yeah.
And like then when you think about, all right, now I'm going to ask you to not just think about like the direct effects today and try and optimize for those, but I'm going to ask you to think about what happens like 3 congressional cycles from now, when you might not be in office, when you might not reap the political benefits or face the political consequences, right? Like you don't reap the benefits of success, and you don't face the consequences of failure necessarily, right? Then that creates a lot of focus on the present value of whatever you're doing, and if we can't even get those right, then it becomes really difficult for us to think about these sort of longer term like strategic planning.
And, then you have these sort of whiplash effects where it's like, some new conflict emerges, right? You face like an imminent concern today, you roll back an intervention that you introduced before, right? And it's basically just, you're shifting your priorities and constantly reevaluating. And then that doesn't lend itself for the kind of long-term planning you need to fix the problems you were talking about earlier, right? Like to think about how do we go in and build that more just and like secure and prosperous world that we were talking about before, right? How do you go do that? Like that's a long-term commitment to a place. And I think there are reasonable questions about like how much should American taxpayers be responsible for the citizens of another country, right? And like helping them build their country.
Right. I mean, that goes back to Afghanistan, which we were talking about.
That's right. Yeah.
I think I was doing a bit of research on some of your current projects, and one of the things is the refugee repatriation project.
Yeah.
And how, really talking again about people moving, more people are on the move at any time, like now more than any time in human history. I think and if you go like a bit into the project, it was an interesting natural experiment, right, of like seeing people who had cash assistance versus not, and decoupling repatriation with conflict. Is that right?
Yeah, no, that's right. I mean, this is one of these, all credit for the initial idea goes to my co-author, Christopher Blair, who's at Princeton now, was a PhD student at Penn at the time, and for thinking about this big question of how do we evaluate the impact of large-scale resettlement, right? The movement of individuals who were previously displaced from their country back home. Right, so repatriation, and that's a really hard problem, because when we think about, and this is like what the paper emphasizes, what you're picking up on, which is that like there are these episodes throughout history, recent history, where we observe this mass relocation back to a place of origin, right, or mass outflow away from a conflict. But crucially, it's all happening because it's endogenous to conflict, right? And so then when we're thinking about how do we go in and we do an evaluation of the mass relocation of individuals, it's really hard because it's often embedded within a context where the driver is the very thing that we would like to be able to study the impact on, and it's so closely coordinated with one another. And this project is a nice opportunity to begin thinking about how do you go in and do that. And to our knowledge, it's the very first of its kind to do effectively a natural experiment impact evaluation of resettlement at scale. And this is all coming from a shock induced by a change in cash assistance that was provided by the United Nations to individuals who relocated from Pakistan back to Afghanistan. And there's a lot of as you might imagine in a space like this, when you're thinking about like a lot of individuals, a lot of at-risk individuals, and this kind of conflict, sensitivities to the side, a lot of military-age males who are at risk relocating to a context of ongoing conflict, and that the timing of the policy was timed to, as it turns out, coincide with the beginning of the fighting season, right? This could have been an absolute disaster. In terms of planning, right, and in terms of the unintended harm that it could have created, like it was very serious, and it was unclear whether or not it had those effects, and there were a lot of conjectures, and there still are a lot of conjectures about the effects of repatriation and relocation on conflict, right? What happens when you take a mass of individuals who have been abroad, who have been exposed to all sorts of economic and political hardship, right? All sorts of insecurity. And now they're coming back home, a place they've been dislocated from for maybe months or maybe years or maybe decades. They're coming back to an origin community away from which they have drifted, right? And to whom they might be viewed as an enemy or like at least a rival, right? A competitor. Putting pressure on that destination community, the host community that they're going back to. Like, those are all like serious concerns. And there are so many like theories that one could come up with which suggests that like it's a tinderbox, right? That you just, you're about to light a match, and we're going to see this whole thing light up in a way that's obviously was not the intention of a program that would lead to a wave of return. So, what we do is we can take advantage of the unexpected timing of when the cash transfers were announced, and what you see is within days, there's a flood. There's just a wave of individuals who are returning back to the country, taking advantage of this doubling of cash assistance, which in that context is a significant sum of money. Especially when you think about this at like a median household scale, it's a very large amount of money. In the context. And you see this mass wave of return that could have had all these disastrous effects on the reemergence and sort of intensification of the conflict or escalation of the conflict. And indeed what we end up seeing, right, is that either the conflict is unaffected overall, or there are some types of violence that go down, right? And in particular, the thing to remember is that, like, this is one of the benefits of them not returning on their own. They're returning with this effectively a significant economic stimulus, right? Is that can have spillover effects across households within the target communities where they go back to. And indeed what we see is this like a significant decrease in labor-intensive violence, which is consistent with the story that they're effectively increasing the reservation wage of fighting, right? Because they're coming back with cash, right? And of course we can't go ask the Taliban how much were they paying their fighters, right? We can't find direct evidence of that wage mechanism, but all of the evidence points in this direction, especially when we think about what would civilians demand for valuable information, and so we see some results there as well.
Wow.
But of course, like when you're in this world, right? You're budget constrained. You have an interest in maintaining the production of violence, and now it becomes more difficult and costly for you to produce one kind of violence. Maybe you turn to another, right? And so what we end up seeing, right, is that there is this reduction in labor-intensive violence, and to be clear, that is like the mass of violence, right? But what they end up substituting into are the types of violence that are insensitive to this shock, or largely insensitive to this shock, which is capital-intensive roadside bombings. And so what they start doing is they start investing more in that type of weaponry, and so that's that is what we see. And as an additional test of that mechanism, what you see is not only are they increasing the number, but the sophistication of those attacks increases as well. Right, the impact that it has on the conflict is increasing, right? And so it's a bit of a double-edged sword, right? In one sense, like what we found is that overall, like violence is not really moving around that much, right? But that's actually masking these like splits, where it is moving in a way consistent with the story about reservation wages, and it is moving in a way consistent with an insurgent group having an incentive to produce violence, but now being constrained in one way, and so they're going to substitute, and it turns out when they substitute, they're substituting into the most deadly form of violence. And when they substitute into that form of violence, they're making increased investments in that. Mm. It's becoming more technologically sophisticated, and they're harming even more people than they did before.
Right.
Right. And so, this is, like we were talking about earlier, it's like all coming full circle. When we think about a policy intervention, you got to think about the first order effects, but then you got to think about second, third, and fourth order, and all those downstream consequences, because what ends up happening is that Afghanistan overall doesn't become necessarily a more violent place, but it becomes a significantly more dangerous place, especially in the places that those individuals are going to, and not necessarily because of any fault of their own.
Right. It's
becoming more dangerous because of a strategic substitution by an armed actor who still has an interest in producing violence to disrupt the state, right? And that's what makes this so hard to think about policy interventions, right? And because when we think about, we can put our finger on one problem, we can kind of block off one channel, and then that starts spouting off this game, which is there's like a game of whack-a-mole where I'm going back and forth, and now I'm stretched across all these things. It's like that scene from Star Wars, right?
That's cool.
There may have been a collab between the Asia Foundation and UNHCR, and so that there are some things that you have to be careful with is the sensitivities of data and how things change, right? When we began working on that project, there was still a democratically elected government in Afghanistan, right? And it's a non-trivial thing, right? Because when we have a series of papers, this is now you're seeing the underbelly of academic publishing is that it takes way too long to actually get papers out. But we had papers that were submitted before the takeover, that then the takeover happened, and it's like, okay, like when we initially submitted, like we were free to release all of this, or like a good chunk of this data, and now we have like very serious concerns that about how this data might be appropriated by bad actors in bad ways, and so this is, we have in particular we have a project on information operations during the war, and the impact on civilian collaboration, and making that data publicly available in any way would basically be a map to collaborators, which like collaborators in the sense that like they were actively supporting, the provision of security in their area. They were just doing it to the wrong actor. Or now.
No,
right?
right.
And so when the paper was submitted, it was, they were coordinating with the active government of Afghanistan. But then when the paper was accepted and was about to be published, now they were collaborating with the former regime, right? And so that's the kinds of things that you have to be careful with. But no, I mean, I'm glad you brought up the credential program, because this is again like it's opportunities for us to be thinking about how can we use that as a test bed, or how can we think about using that to refine our ideas. Actually, Hannah, you asked this question earlier about a territorial control project, right? It feels like hours ago now. And what
the magic of mixing
the magic
together.
of editing. So you asked about a project, and actually, people in this program, right? They were some of the first to see that data in the wild, right? And some of them were giving lots of feedback about how to think about the measurement strategy, how to think about that, and shout out to them, because this is basically, I got to use that as an opportunity to trial run an idea, to get their thoughts on wrinkles and where it might not work and under what conditions it does work, and that's all tremendously useful, right? And so this is where, again, to go back to those earlier themes, where it's so important that we realize that there's an interplay between research and teaching, because if you use your work to guide your teaching, you can use your teaching to inform the work that you do, right?
And then, in fact, policy from there.
And then ultimately, look, I've spent the past week thinking seriously about this, right? That the work that we do is a three-legged stool, right? And one of these legs is research, the core thing that drives universities, especially research universities, the production of knowledge, right? And that's important. The second leg is the leg of teaching, right? Enabling your students to be successful in the world by recasting the way that they think about problems, and giving them the toolkits to be successful, right? And to go out and to have the impact that you hope they will, whether they go off in industry or they go work in the public sector, local, state, federal, international, right? You hope that you can do that. And the third leg is doing, right? The third leg is actually going out and trying to reshape the world, not just through your research and not just through your teaching, but through active sort of policy engagement, policy consultation. And I will say that, to me, this is the hallmark of the place that is doing its job well, is that we both think on our own, we train people to think, but we also do, and we train people to do, right? And as of late, I've been thinking a lot about this notion that there is no higher calling than public service, both in the interest of your state, in the interest of your nation, and in the interest of humanity. And I hope that we play a small part of recasting the shape of the world in all of its multifaceted dimensions by training the people who will go do those things and make it that more just and prosperous and secure place, right?
Just and prosperous.
Yeah. No, absolutely. I think you mentioned it as a stool, right? Is that the stool of the university, or who sits on that stool?
Yeah, no, I think so. For me, it's it's a three-legged stool. I don't know who actually sits on the stool. Maybe Jose over here. But but when I think about, in some ways, right, it can't function, right? If one of these is tueca, right? If one of these is broken or
Spanglish
too short.
over here. Let's go. Represent. Austin, where you at?
If one of these is not functioning, right? It's it's underdeveloped, or it's immature, or maybe it doesn't even exist. It's not stable,
Right.
And I don't know, maybe this is not the point of university in general, because I think that maybe there are some parts of the university, like philosophy departments or humanities departments or the liberal arts, that should exist in a way that's that lives the life of the mind, right? But when I think about what is like the aspiration of a place that would like to have an impact, that would like to have influence,
Right.
like this is how it happens, right?
Right.
We can't really do that. It's like if I think about what is the difference between a public policy school and an NGO, or what's the difference between a public policy school and a think tank, right? NGO is really focused on advocacy, right? It's focused on doing, right? And maybe there are some people inside of it that are engaged in research. In fact, many of those NGOs are engaged in research, but they're not engaged in teaching. And when we're thinking about, a think tank, right? The think tank might be actively involved in research, and it might actually be actively involved in lobbying, right? But it's not going to be actively involved in training people, right? And so then where is the one place where all of these things can collide with one another, right? Where you hopefully learn all of these things together. It's a university, right? And maybe not a university in general, maybe a professional school, right? Where it's not, we don't just train people to think, we train people to practice.
Right.
Which is great because it's like low stakes environment to an extent, right? Like you can fail here and still grow.
Oh, sure.
It's going to help you be a better researcher and critical thinker.
I thought that was like the most dry joke I've heard all day. It's like low stakes setting, no big deal. We were just talking about like mass relocation of people from Latin America to the United States. No, but I think you're absolutely right? It's like you should think about this is the laboratory.
Yes.
Right. It's an opportunity for you to take your time, like at a place like Harris.
Yeah.
Right. And where, in the classroom, you're not having that direct effect, and you can shoot trial runs on ideas. I mean, I just did a trial run on an idea earlier, and
did it land?
No. In one sense, it landed, but it burned. And like that's a good thing where it's like, okay, it's like helpful to be able to bounce ideas and get a sense of what other people's priorities are, right? And where they see that going, because then they can give you feedback about your idea before you actually go out and make perhaps a mistake, right? And yeah, I think that's absolutely right. But again, the reason why it's so helpful to have that like low stakes setting where you get to train, you get to think about these problems, is so that when you go out in the real world, you've had that time to reflect. You've figured out the like best practices. You know that, okay, before I go out and I do this thing, I should assemble the smartest people I know and ask them for their sage wisdom. Get that advice, right? And part of like a time, like the time that you spend here at Harris, I hope all of this is like aspirational, because I don't know, because I'm not you, right? Like I don't know what the experience is like, and I'm sure everyone has different experiences, but I hope, right, that like you take this time to build out your social network, that you take that time to find like, oh, here are my trusted advisors that I can go to. And like maybe that's meant in like a a purely personal sense where like I need advice on like some life choice that I'm making, maybe some furniture that I'm buying, but mean it in a broader sense as well, right? Which is that like you're finding the people, you're building the network that you're going to come back to over and over and over again to seek advice, because you've been through what I hope is like a challenging experience. Hopefully it's not too stressful, but a challenging experience where like you are forged in fire to think about ways and to think about things in a similar way.
Can confirm, forged in fire.
Right.
Absolutely. It's interesting that you think about that. You're sharing your thoughts about how we can think about each other, right? So like Hannah and I, right, and the entire class here, as advisors. Because I remember, I think on day one, or I forget when the kickoff was for admissions, when Renjin Daniels stepped up and said, you should think about each other as like your future board members for some sort of firm or some sort of like consultant agency. So I'm thinking now, like, yeah, I definitely know who to call if I need help figuring out how do I deflate this value to constant 2022, or my code's not working. Can someone lend me a hand because I don't understand why this is not working so well, or just pitching an idea. So I think this is definitely a place to generate social capital and then leverage for the future and hopefully to do good, right? Try to apply and change the world using evidence-based approaches.
Yeah, and hopefully think about those second, third order effects too for things that you're doing.
Which I think is really a conversation about ethics. And so I think this is a good setup to transition to asking.
I like that segue. That
Yeah.
was like totally
yeah.
natural.
Yeah, brought to you by Spotify.
Available wherever you get your podcasts.
Student discount, let's go. So in the policy world, sometimes there's pressures by stakeholders, and you kind of alluded a little bit to it in terms of like, the change of regime, at least in Afghanistan. So sometimes these pressures come in different forms, right, for a type of research, maybe sometimes like a shiny object or chasing the news cycle. So, Austin, how do you stay true to objective evidence-based policy research? And has there ever been a project pitched to you that tested the moral boundaries as a researcher?
Earlier we were talking about how the skills that you acquire, hopefully like the way that we teach you to think about the world, helps you realize it's not just ways of thinking about things like counterinsurgencies. It might be ways of thinking about great power competition, near peer competition. It might be ways of thinking about dynamics of, say, population movement, right? And I remember, I think like most listeners who were here at the time, in May, June of 2020, really thinking through a series of events that were unfolding, both the murder of George Floyd, but the subsequent response, right? The mobilization of public for demands that there be changes, right? And of course, one can debate about the merits of those demands, and in the end, whether or not they were actually effective at shaping criminal justice outcomes and the interaction between marginalized communities in the criminal justice system, their experiences of the criminal justice system. But this was a moment of a reckoning, and a very personal one for me, which is that my wife is African American. My children are triracial, right? So they're part African American, they're part Hispanic, and they're white. And there was this moment where, of course, like it doesn't take having to have like a personal exposure. I would hope, right? It's part of me being more empathetic, right? We don't need to just be thinking about things that directly affect us, but in the end, when I was thinking about this episode, what struck me, right, is that I was getting real. So my daughter, all of my children are beautiful. All of them are brilliant. All right, I'm just glad they look like their mother, right? I suppose most parents would probably say that, but I genuinely mean it, right? Like, these kids are great kids, and I have like zero responsibility for making them that way. It's, but I look at my daughter, right? So she's now 10, and she, if we're sort of just if one were to describe her, right, and one were to pick a race to describe her, visibly,
yeah, expressed, right?
Like her, they would probably pick white, right? Mm-hmm. So she has gray-green eyes. She has brown hair, straight brown hair, and she is light-skinned, right? Mm-hmm. Her physical appearance, one might think that she is actually only one race, not three, right? And then my son, right, my first son, his name is Simon. He's got like people around here know him, or on the Twitter know him, because he's got like burnt orange hair. It's like copper, it like glows in the sun. It's incredible, and it's curly. And if one were to ask, is this child at least partially African American, the answer would certainly be yes. And as all of these things were unfolding, I had this moment. I was sitting in our backyard, and I was like contemplating life, and I was watching my children play. And what hit me in that moment was this like profound sense of concern that I had no agency to affect the world that my children are going to live in a very particular way, which is that someday Rosie and Simon will be walking down the street, and Simon will be racially profiled, but Rosie will not. And they don't necessarily look like brother and sister. They have some similarities, but like he will be racially profiled and she won't be. And like there's nothing that can like break the heart of a parent more than the idea of their children suffering, and suffering for no fault of their own.
You're right.
Right. in a way that like you have such like limited locus of control to affect, right? And again, I want to emphasize that it's like it shouldn't take it being personal for it to matter. These kinds of things just should matter. But in this moment, for me, it was very personal, right? And of course, I felt like, man, like what value, come on, Hannah, like what value do I add? Like I work with data, like what can I do, right? Like I'm not going to affect change like immediately with going to a protest. I'd really,
You don't want
generally those are like not particularly effective like modes of like actually achieving change.
Yeah, driving change, yeah.
But one thing that did strike me is that I was seeing news coverage of events that were authentic, events that were coordinated by and supported by Black Lives Matter and allied groups, or coordinated just by like-minded individuals, right? Not even necessarily tied to Black Lives Matter as an institution. And I was reading news reports of those authentic protests being penetrated by inauthentic actors, members of the Aryan Nation, members of white supremacy groups, who were attempting to undermine what they were doing, right? And they were going to do that by engaging in acts of arson, by engaging in acts of looting, or making it appear as if they're looting, and then engaging in acts of violence against the police, with the intention of triggering a response from the police, which then leads to an escalation. And then, of course, the narrative of what would have otherwise been like a relatively peaceful event, making very serious demands, but a relatively peaceful event, it gets distorted. Right? So basically, they can hijack the narrative of coverage and make it about something that sort of fits into a trope, right? And when I read about this, I was like, oh, finally, I am of value. Because, like, I'm a data person, and this sounds like an empirical question, and I have an idea. And the idea is, if we can find a way of estimating all of the locations of these events, of the protests that are occurring, and I can, okay, this is going to sound a little scary. If I can then track all of the individuals who participate in this protest, and then I can look at where those individuals come from, then I can discern the likelihood that those individuals are authentic participants. But more likely than not, the focus would be on identifying the set of individuals who are inauthentically engaging, and whether or not those protests that involved members of the public that may have been inauthentically engaging, or may have only been there as agitators or saboteurs, there to distract, whether or not those were indeed the ones that were more likely to escalate to arson, right? And so I worked with an amazing co-author of mine. We very quickly put together a project. It took us a couple of days. Again, this is when earlier you talked about data access and things like that. This is the perk of having a lot of data, is that you can readily work on projects of interest to yourself, and we were able to do that, right? So we came up with a method using cell phone trace data, so GPS trace data. So for all you listeners who are listening on your phone, right, you should know, if you don't already, because I say this quite a bit now, that your phone is just it's a surveillance device that happens to make phone calls, right? And I mean that in a very skeptical, critical sense, but also in a bit of a comical sense, right? Because the thing that we're using is actually just marketing data, right? It's data that when you're on Angry Birds, or what's the new thing? The TikTok?
Yeah.
The TikTok, the gram, right? You do it for the gram.
Yeah.
All
Right.
LinkedIn all the time. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, we're here in Harris, yes,
Yeah.
definitely.
Yeah,
This is
that's
a
right,
professional
that's right.
school, so we use the professional network now.
Yeah.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah.
That LinkedIn Premium.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Shout out. It's
50%. Can I get my 50%?
That's right. That's right. Yeah. Wherever you find your podcast. That was really good, Hannah. You're very professional at that. It's almost like you've done that before. So I think it's everywhere, right? Almost everything you do with your cell phone, you're leaving breadcrumbs. At least up until a couple of years ago, you're leaving breadcrumbs that allow me to track basically your patterns of life, right? And it is, in some sense, it's not as scary as it sounds, but in another sense, it is absolutely as scary as it sounds. And of course, I'm a scientist. I'm not a marketer, so I'm not interested in necessarily interested in that dimension of things. I'm interested in what I can do with that data. So we figured out a way to estimate locations of protests using this data. But in order to do the harder part, the real thing, to be able to back out who the inauthentic participants were with high fidelity, what we would have needed is more precise information. So we reached out to an organization that had this information. Had a conversation with them. They were thrilled at the idea of the project. They were willing to grant us access to this information at an extremely steep discount. And we were trying to figure out whether or not we were going to buy it, and then the clarification came. The clarification came that one of the reasons behind the willingness to grant this, is because it would be of value to the organization, and not just that organization, but other entities of the federal government.
Oh, so this is a public-facing institution.
Yeah. So other elements of the government that would be interested in what we find and how we found it, and the IP. And so so I had conversations. Look, as a scientist, like, I was torn. I mean, you all know this. I love data, and what they were about to do is like keys to the kingdom, right? In some sense, right? Thinking about, like, well, you all have seen The Dark Knight.
Yeah, I love that movie.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank goodness you all have you seen The Dark? Okay. All right. Awesome. All right. So think about this as like that scene where they're using echolocation to do a 3D scan of Gotham to identify the Joker. You all remember the scene? It's like kind of wild. Yeah, so that's the world where that started off as fiction, and then it became fact. And the fact is this data that they were willing to give us access to. Is like you can map with extremely high fidelity the movements of the vast majority of devices in the United States.
That's crazy.
Okay. Now, what that would allow you to do is to understand where there were locations where inauthentic individuals were going in to engage in bad faith behavior to undermine a movement. A movement that, for all the reasons that we just talked about earlier, like
right.
I was interested in understanding and supporting. And that has very serious ethical implications, right? And not in the sense of like the immediate thing, although one could think about just like, should one be able to have access to this in general? But in the downstream things. And this is where you can't just think about the first order implementation of what you're doing, because that might be done in good faith. That might be done with what you think of as the best interests of the public in mind, yourself. But you have to think that once you have opened this box, once you have revealed the thing and how useful the thing can be, if there is no one there to constrain bad actors who might use it, then you're responsible for what they might do with what you have produced, right? And this is the point where you have to begin thinking about, is this paper dangerous, right? Maybe not dangerous today, but maybe dangerous in the future. Or how could it be hijacked, right, for a purpose that was completely unintended? Now, that's probably true of most research that we do, right? Like, if you tell me how to rebuild an economy, you're also giving me a backwards map to how to destroy it, right? And if you're telling me these are ways that I can go fix the link between conflict and growth, or conflict and like some public policy intervention, you're also telling me, okay, how can I go enhance conflict as well? That's probably true of most of the things that we do. But this was, in a very real sense, a natural thing that one could do after releasing this thing, which would be, well, you told me the subset that were inauthentic. Let me just flip this around, and I'm going to go find the authentic ones. And not just that, but I'm going to go find the repeats. I'm going to go find, like, the leaders of the organizations behind that, the people who are showing up repeatedly at protests, who appear to be engaging in coordination, given their location, right, within like the flow of individuals within a site. And so that's one of these situations where we had to think seriously about were there sufficient safeguards in place.
Wow.
And the answer was no. And so what did we end up doing? We ended up shelving the paper, right? We ended up shelving that paper, and we backed away from that project. right? Now, things to know, right? Like at the time, this was 2020, right? Like, I was like still fairly early on the tenure track.
Mm-hmm.
Every paper matters,
Mm-hmm.
right? So professionally, this was a costly decision to make.
Mm.
And personally, I felt really invested in what we had done, right? Because this project had given me a way that I could do something,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like I felt powerless in that moment that like I could go down the street and raise my voice, but do I actually think that that's going to have a real impact? Like that's not my comparative advantage.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not the person who goes out. I'm not the person who will go lead that movement. That's not me, right? I'm not the community organizer. I'm a professor, right? Like I work with data. And so like finally I had an opportunity where I felt like I could be of value, and then to realize like, oh, there was this ethical challenge, a very serious ethical challenge of concern over how it could be misappropriated, that like, dang, the thing that I thought would be my value add might actually have these unintended consequences, right? And so yeah, we backed away from that. And that was a hard thing to do, like professionally and personally, right? But I think it's important, right, to be willing to do that. Yeah.
So when someone says, if you're not going to do it, we're going to find someone else to do it.
Mm-hmm.
What does that even faze you? Do you just take solace or take knowing peace that that wasn't you? Or 'cause I guess I'm thinking about like Oppenheimer, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
The war to end all wars.
Exactly.
Like the weapon to end all wars, which didn't
exactly.
work. Yeah.
Exactly. So
Yeah.
that's why I'm like wondering, like, had that guy left and not created the atomic bomb, it was a race until someone else created it, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I wonder, how do you feel about if you don't do it, someone else does, and someone else is going to maybe get the tenure, or somebody else is going to get the praise?
Yeah.
How do you can you deal with, doesn't even matter?
It does matter, right? It does matter, right? Like I think that like if you think that the thing that you're gonna do is like not sufficiently specialized, right? That like somebody else can just go do the thing that you did, right? Then well that's something for you to weigh in your decision,
Mhm.
right? A slightly different version of this is, let's just say like I think that actually what that person will do is the wrong thing. Like they're gonna make some like fundamental error. They
Mhm.
don't have this like tweak that I thought of, right?
Oh.
Then you're like, okay, oh shoot, like now I've got to weigh not just the idea that someone else is going to go do the thing, but they're going to do it worse than I could have done, right? You're like, oh,
That's ever-consuming.
that weighs too, right? That weighs too.
Yeah.
But I think that's also the appeal of a scoundrel, right? In some sense, where it's like if you can convince yourself that someone else is going to do it, like that's just an appeal, so that you feel better about the fact that you really wanted to do the thing. And now you're using it as like motivation for actually just doing the thing, for rationalizing doing the thing. So you have to like these are things to kind of balance, right? It's like, okay, like am I really genuine about the idea that someone else is going to go do this, right? And if they're going to go do it, they're going to do it worse, and it's going to be wrong, and it's going to be wrong in really important ways. And like if that is true, then you have to take a step back and think, okay, am I only doing that to rationalize the thing that I wanted to do to begin with? Am I only doing that to rationalize the sort of benefits that I might receive from it, or am I genuine in my belief that it could be done? Now, I mean, what we did is not terribly difficult, right? Like the intuition is pretty straightforward, but like, do I actually think that other people could do it if like we did? I don't know. Doubt it. I mean, we were the first ones that did it, and like maybe the answer is yeah, like somebody else would have had the idea and they would have put it together, but like. The human capital inputs to produce that kind of thing are non-trivial. Like human capital and real capital, right, in terms of data, are like non-trivial, right, to put all these things together. And I will say, Jose, I'm ready to like, we're gonna melt. We're gonna I'm gonna burst some bubbles here and tell you that like we often have this idealized vision of like all the sort of meritocratically selected technocrats who run government, or meritocratically selected technocrats who work in industry, who are like for profit reasons all like very positively selected and doing the right thing at the right time because there's like either public interest or private interest that are driving. No, I'm here to tell you when you go off and you're like working in the real world, everything has a distribution. Right, and there's a very real chance that like you're probably overestimating the capabilities of those entities, those organizations, those groups, right? Even if they're like-minded, they would like to do the thing that you're doing, they're probably not capable of doing that thing. I mean, depending on how specialized it is, right?
Oh.
But get prepared to be frequently disappointed. If you go in thinking that like, oh, the people I'm going to be interacting with are all like the best of the best, right?
No, I think so. For the listeners, before coming to Harris, I had some time to work on the Hill, and I remember coming straight out of undergrad after a year, thinking about who runs government, right? Very much to that extent of like, it's got to be the top people, right? Because it's challenging. It's a really hard place to break into, do some really good work. But being on the Hill, this is not a reflection of the office where I was at, but you realize that, fundamentally people are still people, right? People still need soft deadlines. People don't necessarily have the right tool set to do it. And some people just know the system well enough to put your little idea from point A to point B. And they have their win. And that's all they really care about. Sometimes it's not even about what the bill does, what the goal is. Sometimes it's just getting a win. I think that's one of my issues of working in the Hill. It's like it became more about political theater, than it did about policy. Still a good experience. Got to learn a lot. Met some awesome people at work. Grew. But yeah, I think it's very true that we have this imagination, maybe because we're taught, like us, I was political science and international relations undergrad, of like what the Congress is, right? It's the pinnacle of democracy. It is the top. But at the end of the day, it's still run by humans, right? Humans are imperfect. And so I think there's a lot of truth in like, yeah, there's going to be some disappointment there. But hopefully you come to a place like Harris to try to change that, right? To take up that space, to bring your skill set that is incredibly valuable and missing, because you matter.
Yeah, no, I that's right. I mean, I think that, earlier we were talking about legacy. We were talking about like why we do the things that we do, right? We were talking about the fact that we're all like purpose-seeking animals. And I think that you're absolutely right that a core part of what we hope we can do, right, is that we can affect like how many meritocratically selected technocrats there are, right? And that the people going into these positions of power will be taken more seriously if they have the skill sets that we like to train people to think about. So, yeah, in some sense, I want people to be constantly skeptical, right? In general, like I want people to be constantly skeptical of what they see, the world around them, what it actually means, the relationships that are underneath it. Like, is it causal, or does it happen to just be a correlation, right? And I want people to be skeptical, but also at the end of the day, like the reason why we like embed within you this like inherent, hopefully, state of like skepticism is that so that you do your best work, right? That you go out and like you could be a part of that change. Right, but I want you to know that going in, you will be surprised just how much growth there is left to achieve. Right.
Right. Mindful of time, I just want to maybe wrap up and ask a couple just concluding questions.
Sure.
Related to that, you've talked about a couple papers that you recommend to your students in your classes and things that you admire. If there was a paper or book that you'd say, like, every public policy student or anybody who's interested in this space or people who are interested in conflict or whatever your qualifier is, what paper would you recommend to people as something to really get a sense of what you're talking about here?
Hot dog. Okay, that's a hard one. All right, so there's a paper called Aid Under Fire, published almost a decade ago now, if not a decade ago now, on a community-driven development program in the Philippines that was at least partially sponsored by the World Bank, is an interesting read. I think in many ways it's an exemplar of how to write a paper. The introduction of that paper is phenomenal. I go back and I reread that introduction of that paper often.
Wow.
Because to me, it's like it's short, it's punchy, it's to the point. It says exactly what it needs to say, right? And it clarifies the stakes. Right, and often, like, as academics, we're not so interested in, like, oh, well, you're going to come up with, like, an exact t-test or something like this. Like, okay, all right, bro. Like, like that's helpful in some sense. And, like, it is meaningful. It is meaningful. It is science. It is science. It is knowledge. And I respect that work, right? But when, I'm thinking about, okay, what is the work that I find, like, meaningful? It's not just about, like, again, thinking about the world or like coming up with a better mousetrap. It is like something that tells me something unique about an actual setting. And this is a paper that the introduction to which is like fantastic in that sense. It's an exemplar, right? And so as a teaching tool, I love this paper. It is also a paper that clarifies the stakes of the work that we do. And so the World Bank has been pretty forthright, like the benefits of that program were minimal, right? So this community-driven development program is basically them going out and rather than imposing a set of projects onto a community, they incentivize the community to come up with the projects that they thought would be the most helpful. Okay, and so like in theory, this should be the driver of change, right? Like I don't come in with my like generally uninformed generic theory of change or development. I'm going to go in and I'm going to ask the community, the stakeholders, like, where do you see this as adding the most value? Tell me. Have a council that decides, and then ultimately the community will get to drive the development, right? Great idea. Turns out it didn't really work, right? It didn't really work in like generating the amount of growth. There was like basically minimal return on investment, okay? And World Bank is pretty transparent about that. Like, at least in that particular place, with that particular set of projects, with that scale of funding, it was less effective than they would have hoped. Okay. Now, what the paper does is say, like, all right, we're not gonna focus on that part. Instead, we're gonna focus on the fact that running a program like this, you're running in the context of an ongoing insurgency. And what is the nature of community-driven development? But winning hearts and minds by achieving community engagement. And when you're running this program, what should you have at the top of your mind? Risk potential. And because what you're having those communities do who are eligible for the program is meet and coordinate. And at the core of what they're doing is figuring out, do we want to engage with the government? Right. And in the context of an ongoing conflict, that means that now you're putting civilians in harm's way. By making this choice public in a way that it would not have been before, by making it high stakes and observable, right? And so what this paper does is take seriously this potential concern. And the nice part about the project is they've got incredible data on conflict dynamics, and what they ultimately find is that there is a surge in violence. Not in general, like not overall, right? Surge in violence in the planning period, when the villages are having to decide whether or not they take the government's money. And the nice part, like the reason why this is like such a well-regarded paper is that like the way the aid was allocated was according to a ranking rule. So there's a running variable and there's a cutoff, at which point there are some communities just inside of the cutoff who are eligible and some just outside of the cutoff who are not eligible. And your listeners who've just been through this, like you should know this is regression discontinuity, right? And so it's like a built-in natural experiment, almost like an experiment. And they find that there's a surge in violence in the barely eligible communities, right? And so, that subsides, and like who pays the cost? They're going out, they're targeting government actors. Who's engaged in the violence? Political actors, right? So the ones that are actually initiating violence against the state are political organizations, right? Not criminal organizations. And again, it's a reminder, right, of like the stakes of the work that we do, right? That like we cannot just be focused on the first order effects. We must think about the fact that we are embedding an intervention within a complex setting. We're not studying something in a vacuum. Like when we're making real policy, there are real effects, right? And we need to learn from that. I'll say one other thing real quick about that paper. So I really like that paper. It's super nice, very well written.
That's
like
Aid
easy.
Under Fire?
Yeah, Aid Under Fire.
Got it.
Joe Felter, Ben Crost. Excellent paper. The setting, though, is super interesting and lends itself to other research. And got some friends on the World Bank, at the World Bank, who work on these problems, who think about the Philippines, who think about community-driven development. And one day, like, they came across a paper that claimed that this program led to extreme deforestation. Okay. And I will say this was like this was a bit of a wake-up call to me, right? About as a reminder, right? So to go back to this question earlier about like sort of ethical dimensions, right? You gotta think about who you're partnering with, right? You gotta evaluate like do do I actually believe in the mission of what they do? Because like when you work with someone, potentially, you're giving them a non-trivial part of your life. Right? Like, you only got one life, right? And like you're taking that time, that scarce time, your most scarce resource, which is your time. You're giving it to this organization, and you got to think about: am I ready to back their play? Right? Are they serious about the work that they do, or am I just doing this in a transactional way?
Wow.
And I can tell you that when the World Bank found out about this, they came to me and they said, Austin, you've thought about this. You've thought about related projects quite a bit. And I was like, oh, I happen to know quite a bit about this context. I've read that paper way too many times. And they were like, we want to know is what they found right. Like we don't have people necessarily, is to go back to the point earlier, right? Like they want to build out those technical skills, but they don't have people on their team, and that particular team who can go in and read that paper and assess, like, is it actually credible that there's that level of deforestation? And so they came to me and they said, we need your help. Like, could you please like help us with this? Because if this is right, we will need to go in immediately. We're going to make a public statement. We're going to go issue restitution. We're going to go find a way to make those communities whole. And we will take this into consideration in future projects. Right?
Wow.
And that was that moment where I was like, oh, damn. Like I've been working with them. I like the work that they do. I think they're serious about the work that they do. They think about evidence. But I'd never been in a conversation like that where a stakeholder was like, if we messed up, it's not just oops.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, we are going to go and make this right.
Mm-hmm.
And they were serious about this.
It's a lot of power to you. That's a lot of power as a researcher to kind of drive that change.
Yeah, well, I mean, yeah, and like, you know, pretty high stakes when somebody's like, hey, if
it's the World Bank.
If you think this is right, if you think this project is right, like, we're going to go fix this problem. We'll fix it. We're going to allocate resources. You know, we'll take the reputational hit, but that's because like we are seriously committed to change. Like, we are seriously committed to the work of the World Bank.
Wow.
And it turns out, I mean, almost everything about that paper was wrong.
Oh, wow.
And so, like, I had to go back and I rebuilt all the data behind this paper, and I re-estimated everything, and there were just flaws, like, throughout, and the author had misinterpreted, like, key elements of the regression. They had interpreted the wrong coefficient, like, there were pre-existing, like, level differences across these all sorts of things, right? The paper was just straight up wrong.
Tough.
Like, the whole thing was wrong, right? The whole thing was wrong.
What does it feel like when you find that out? Like when you just realize you just kind of, I mean, this is not like a bad thing, right? But like you kind of just destroyed a paper.
Yeah, well, I mean, like, you know, so what came of that was, and I'm glad that they came. Like, I'm glad that they reached out. I'm glad that they realized they didn't have, and respect to them also for realizing they didn't have the technical skill to fully understand what was going on, to vet what was happening, right? So, you know, shout out to them. And in addition to that, knowing that, like, if it actually was valid, they were going to do something about it, right? It's like, this is important. This is a general life lesson to everybody who's listening to this podcast right now. Know your limitations and surround yourself with people who can help you, right? And that's exactly what they did, because they knew their limitations. They went out and they found someone who could help them. And in the end, they were committed to change if it needed to be changed. In the end, it didn't need to be changed because everything about that paper was wrong. Now, I can tell you that they were very firm about their willingness to make restitution if something were wrong, that something that they had done did actually have this effect. But I can tell you that they applied equally zealous response when I told them that no, the paper was wrong. And they wanted to make it right. And this is the part where, you know, Jose, your question is like a serious one, which is like, look, there's a fellow academic who made not just one error, but like a series of errors. And I mean that. Like, every single thing in that paper was wrong.
Wow.
Every core result in the paper was misspecified or incorrectly interpreted or misrepresented, right? You know, in the end, like, I walked them back from, like, the worst case scenario that they wanted to engage in to correct the record. And instead, I reached out to the researcher myself. I asked them to give me time to help guide them through the process so that they could arrive at their own decision to remove the paper from the internet. Okay. Now, so it's like, but that's tough, right? Like, that's a hard thing. Like, we have teachable moments, right? And that was a teachable moment. Like, those were mistakes that frankly should not have happened, right? But, we all make mistakes. Like, I have certainly made mistakes in what I've done. The work I do is incomplete. I mean, all of our work has mistakes and is incomplete, but that was one that was, like, so profoundly wrong, and profoundly wrong in a sense that was like, meaningful from the policy side.
Wow.
And so it's crucial.
Yeah.
Right. And again, so like you asked, like, what's a paper to read? That's
Right, there we go, yeah.
Pretty friggin' awesome paper to
Yeah.
read. And in addition, like, sets you up to think about a bunch of big picture things.
Right.
Wow. Yeah.
The last question we always ask in our interviews is, what's something you wish we would have asked you that you want to talk about? Use your space to whatever you want. What should we have asked you that we didn't?
About my sneaker collection.
Yeah. Honestly.
Yeah, honestly, it's the root of conflict.
Go into it.
People,
Yeah.
I'm teasing. No, I mean, I think that, look, the sneakers in my office are about to get real.
Yeah.
Okay.
There's about $10,000 worth of sneakers in gold, just for everyone watching.
Right.
They're all encased. It has a level 39 security lock.
That's right,
So
that's
it
right, yeah.
cannot be stolen.
Yeah.
Yeah, my door is definitely not unlocked all the time.
There's definitely not exams on the
Yeah, there's
table.
definitely, exactly. There's definitely not, the answers to the final exam. No, I'm kidding. They are not there. So if you're
This
listening
is not
to
an
this,
advertisement.
This is not an advertisement for Cheeto.com. All right. So I think that, I was joking about the shoes, but I do actually think there's something meaningful that connects back, which is that, like, so the shoes are there in part because I needed to get them out of my house because my kids would mess them up. But big
Correct.
picture, look, we all carry with us, right, the residues of our past. We all carry with us, like, the things that have happened to us before and the experiences that we've had and the things that we grew up with. And the thing that I grew up with is a lack, right? And it wasn't because my parents didn't, like, work hard. They worked really hard. But there were things that they could not do for me, right? And some of the reasons why they couldn't do that were outside of their control, right? But for me, those shoes are a representation of the fact that, like, in some ways I've made it,
Yeah.
right? That, like, I can flex a little bit.
Yeah, you
right?
can get
like,
the nice things.
that you can get the nice things.
No more
and-
Payless shoes, man.
Wow, yeah, no more Payless shoes.
There's nothing wrong with Payless shoes.
There's nothing wrong with Payless shoes.
Invented this whole generation of scholars
Yeah.
here.
Right,
Okay.
yeah.
Shout out to Goodwill. Keeping your boy in the flex, but, like, I mean, real. Like, for me, like, those shoes are a manifestation of the fact that, like, I made it out of a bad situation. I mean, not a bad situation, like, a bad situation. I guess, like, that's pretty straight up. Yeah, the
Yeah,
situation.
you gotta own it. You gotta own it.
It was a situation that, like, I am extraordinarily fortunate to have been able to move beyond. And for me, the shoes are a very real manifestation of that fact. They're a visual reminder every time I walk into my office that, like, you got to keep it fresh. But also it's a reminder that, like, with hard work and with dedication, combined with luck and opportunity, like, all is possible, right? And and I mean, to me, when I think about development, right? When I think about, like, the hard questions that are behind, like, the podcast, when I think about, like, the roots of conflict, right? And the roots of these are, like, roots of, like, economic progress and development and justice and security and prosperity. All of these things intersect with one another. And that's just, like, a very real physical manifestation in my office. Like, it's a visual cue to remind myself that, like, I have in some ways, like, made it. Now, there are still other very real things that are constant reminders in my life that the work is not done yet, right? But, every now and then it's okay to also take time and say, look, like, I've worked hard, and I'm going to get myself this nice thing as a reward for the fact that I work hard, and as a reminder of the fact that with hard work comes comes hopefully like the fruit that your labor bears, right? And for me, it just happens to be Jordan 1s, right? And I think other things that I like about my office, right? I've got a lot of things like I have like a bent piston in there, right? Like the arm is bent, and like it's a reminder: don't get bent out of shape, otherwise you're gonna blow up, because that engine blew up, right? Which for me is not just that, right? It's a reminder that like where I came from a house where like I was destined to be a mechanic, and there's absolutely, shout out to my mechanics listening to the podcast. There's nothing wrong with being a mechanic. There's nothing wrong with hard manual labor. Like the world revolves around people who are willing to do tasks like that, right? But it's a reminder that like when I was growing up, education was not a priority. That if anything, I was told not to take education seriously, and that was the path that I was on. It's like kind of a reminder of that, in addition to being a reminder not to get bent out of shape, otherwise you're going to blow up. And I've got other things in my office that they're little tokens of the life that I've led, right? Like I have all of these like cards. I have a thesis, a bound thesis of a student that I advised like ages ago, who's now at Harvard in the PhD program. Shout out to Maria. And she went through DPSS.
Yes, I remember.
Right? And she was a TA she was a TA, and like, it's a reminder, right, of like what you can enable in others. And I have other, I've had the great fortune of people who enjoy my teaching style, and like I love them for it, and I appreciate the things that they shower on me, and like I try and keep as many of those little things in my office as a reminder, because every now and then you have a really bad day, right? I mean, we all have really bad days, right? You have a really bad day, and you need the reminder that, like, it's okay. Like, there's always going to be mean reversion. Like, today was a bad day, but, like, you know what, tomorrow, like, with hard work, I can go and, like, recast things and rebuild things. But, yeah, no, maybe that was the thing I wanted you to ask, because I wanted to explain, because often people walk by my office and be like, their reaction is a bit mixed, right? If you're like faculty, they walk by and they're like, this is the most extraordinarily unprofessional office I've ever been in, and like, what, there should be books here instead of sneakers, I don't understand. And other people will walk by and they'll be like, well, those are like really nice sneakers, it's cool, why do you keep them here? And it's like, okay, here's a straightforward answer. And then there are the people who are like, they realize, like, we lock eyes and they know, because they know my past, and they know that like it's a physical manifestation of something that I get to keep there as a reminder, both that I've done hard work, and with that comes rewards, but also a reminder that like I remember what it was like.
Yeah.
And I remember what it was like to be in those communities, and those are the exact those are the exact people that we hope that through the work of Pearson, through the work of, that you all talk about on this podcast, that we can change.
Yeah.
Right? That we can support them so that they realize that their outside option is not necessarily to participate in the unproductive economy.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Root of Conflict, featuring Professor Austin Wright. This episode was produced and edited by Hannah Balikci and Nishita Karun. Thank you to our interviewers, Jose Macias and Hannah Balikci. Special thanks to UC3P and the Pearson Institute for their continued support of this series. For more information on the Pearson Institute's research and events, visit their website, thepearsoninstitute.org, and follow them on Twitter @PearsonInst. INST is spelled INST. Thank you.